Before we dive into this incredible story, please subscribe to K9 Miracle Stories. Many people watch without subscribing, so hit that button now. The rain was pouring down in sheets, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Inside the small town's police station, the phone rang incessantly, its shrill noise cutting through the already tense atmosphere. Officers hurried back and forth, their boots clicking on the old linoleum floors as they prepared for yet another sleepless night. But they were not ready for what would walk through the door next. At 2:13 a.m., a German shepherd, his fur matted with rain and dirt, limped into the station. His name was Max. He was a K9 officer, a loyal and dependable partner to the force for the last 5 years. But tonight, there was something different about him. He didn't bark or wag his tail like usual. He held something in his mouth, his teeth clenched around an object that didn't belong in the station, a pair of children's shoes stained with dark, ominous red. Detective Sarah Miller was the first to approach, her eyes narrowing as she observed the blood-stained shoes. "Max," she called, crouching down in front of him. "Where did you find these?" She extended her hand to the dog, but Max stepped back, his sharp eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. There was something urgent in his demeanor, something more than just the shoes. It was as if he was trying to tell her something important. "Call the team," Sarah said, her voice tense. "I need the station cleared. This is not a coincidence." She grabbed the shoes carefully, her gloved fingers brushing the fabric. They were small, far too small for an adult. The blood was fresh, the scent still thick in the air. Her mind raced. Children's shoes. Blood. The late hour. It all added up to something she didn't want to believe. "Where's the missing child report?" she asked as she turned back to Max, who had already trotted to the doorway, his head tilted as if waiting for her to catch up. He was calm now, but the urgency hadn't left his eyes. He was leading her somewhere, and somehow, he knew exactly where to go. The missing child case had been filed just hours earlier. A 5-year-old girl named Sophie Carter, last seen playing near her home. The search had already begun, but this was something new, something dangerous. And it didn't take a detective to realize that Max was trying to solve a puzzle that no one else had the pieces for. "Sophie," Sarah murmured to herself as she grabbed her coat. She didn't have time to waste. "Detective." The voice of Officer Tom Bennett interrupted her thoughts. He was holding up a small piece of paper, a hand-drawn map from the Carter family, showing the location of their daughter's last known whereabouts. "This came in just before you arrived. They said she was last playing behind their barn, but they also mentioned hearing strange noises from the woods last night. Sounds like the kind of place Max is leading us." Sarah nodded, her pulse quickening. She wasn't going to let Sophie become another unsolved case. She looked down at the shoes in her hands. The realization hit her hard. Someone had been out there, and Sophie was likely in danger. "We need to move fast," she said, turning back to Max. "Max, lead the way." Max stood tall, his gaze unwavering. Without hesitation, he trotted out the door, pausing only to ensure Sarah followed. His focus was like a laser beam cutting through the night. As they reached the edge of town, the rain began to let up, but the eerie feeling in the air didn't dissipate. Sarah could see the headlights of her squad car cutting through the darkness ahead, but it wasn't the rain or the fog that was making her uneasy. It was the way Max's ears were perked up, the way his steps grew faster as they approached the woods. Her heart raced as she reached for her radio. "We're heading into the woods now. Get a backup team out here," she ordered, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "And keep the searchlight ready." As she crossed the line from the dim lights of the town into the heavy darkness of the woods, a wave of unease washed over her. The trees were thick, their branches heavy with rainwater, creating an almost suffocating atmosphere. It felt like something was waiting in those woods, something malevolent. Max's steps didn't falter. He was relentless. "Good boy, Max," she muttered, though the words felt hollow. He was more than a good dog. He was her partner, and he was about to uncover something that no one in this small town would ever forget. And then she saw it up ahead, barely visible in the dim light from the car's headlights, a faint outline in the brush, a small shape. Sarah's stomach dropped as Max halted, his body stiffening, eyes trained on the dark shape ahead. The silence felt oppressive. "Sophie?" Sarah called out softly, taking a cautious step forward. "Is that you?" But there was no answer, only the crackling of wet branches underfoot. As Max moved closer, his body tense with the weight of what was coming, Sarah's flashlight beam caught something. She looked down in confusion, revealing the source, an overturned toy truck half buried in the mud. The sight was enough to stop her in her tracks. "Oh my God," she whispered, horror flooding her chest. Max growled low in his throat, pulling at the leash. He was done waiting. Sarah held her breath as she followed him, her footsteps almost drowned out by the pounding rain. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't, not while Sophie was still out there. With one last determined look at the path ahead, Sarah spoke into her radio, her voice unshaken despite the overwhelming fear threatening to consume her. "This is K9 Miracle Stories, bringing you real stories of courage and heart like never before. If you haven't subscribed yet, do so now, this case is far from over." She could only hope the team would catch up soon because something dark was happening in these woods, and the truth was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. As the hours wore on, the rain continued to fall, creating a heavy curtain of water that shielded the forest from the world outside. Sarah's breath came in shallow bursts, each step through the sodden forest floor slowing her progress. Her flashlight flickered once, then twice, before settling into a steady beam. The woods were quiet, save for the distant rustle of trees and the sound of Max's paws sinking into the wet earth. He was still leading her, moving with a precision only a K9 could muster. But Sarah could sense something was off. He was more on edge than usual, his movements tense, his ears pinned back. At that moment, Sarah couldn't help but admire him. Max was more than just a canine. He was her protector, her partner, and right now, he was all she had in this godforsaken forest. He sniffed the ground, his body tense as if he was about to uncover something terrible. "Stay focused," Sarah whispered to herself, though she wasn't sure if she was reminding herself or the dog. The sound of her voice, despite its quietness, seemed to reassure her as they trudged on. There was something unsettling about being this deep in the woods at night, especially with a missing child in the mix. And Sophie's blood on those shoes Max had found, lingered in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The woods felt alive with danger, as though something unseen was watching them. The trees creaked as the wind picked up, and the air grew heavier with each passing moment. The flashlight beam flickered once more, casting long shadows between the trunks, making everything seem unfamiliar. But Max remained unaffected. His gaze was fixed, locked ahead as though he could see something Sarah couldn't. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden movement ahead. Max's ears perked, and his body froze. "What is it, boy?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. She leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Max growled low in his throat, a warning, but there was no sound of footsteps, no sign of another person. The only sound was the relentless drizzle of rain as it washed over the foliage. But something was there, hidden just beyond the reach of the flashlight's glow. With a deep breath, Sarah took a step forward. Max was already moving ahead, sniffing the air, his tail rigid and raised. The hairs on Sarah's arms stood up. She felt it too, the unsettling silence of the woods. It felt like something terrible was lurking, something that shouldn't be. And then she saw it. In the distance, the faint outline of a shack, barely visible through the trees. It was small, run down, and clearly abandoned. A shiver ran down her spine as she recognized it for what it was, an old hunting cabin, one that hadn't been used in years. "Max, stay close," she murmured, keeping her voice steady. She knew that whatever she was about to find inside that shack would not be good. Max's growl deepened, his hackles raised as they approached the door. Sarah's heart was hammering in her chest. Her hand instinctively went to her holster, feeling for her gun. She wasn't expecting to find anyone, at least not alive, but her instincts told her to be prepared for anything. They reached the door. It was ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to seep through. The wind had blown it open, but something felt wrong, like the shack was waiting for them, a trap or worse. Sarah nudged the door open with her foot, and Max was in front of her before she could react. He darted into the cabin, his nose leading him directly to a dark corner of the room. There, in the dim light, something glinted. Sarah's stomach twisted as she stepped forward. Max's body was tense, his face drawn in concentration as he approached a small pile of discarded items in the corner. A few old blankets, dirty clothes, and a broken chair lay scattered about. But what caught Sarah's eye was the old wooden chest, half hidden beneath the debris, its lid slightly open. The moment she saw it, she knew. Sarah knelt, her breath catching in her throat. The chest creaked as she pushed the lid open, revealing what had been hidden inside. The sight nearly made her sick. It was a bundle of tattered clothes, but what made her blood run cold was what she found wrapped inside, a doll, blood-stained and torn to pieces, its face unrecognizable. This wasn't a child's toy. It was something far more sinister. Before she could take in the full extent of the scene, Max let out a sharp bark, his head whipping toward the far side of the room. Sarah jumped back, her heart racing as the sound of footsteps echoed from the far corner. A figure emerged from the shadows, his face obscured by a hood. Sarah's hand went to her gun, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of the situation. The figure stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Detective Miller," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You don't want to be here." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sarah's fingers tightened around her gun. She wasn't ready to hear what he had to say, not yet, not until she knew what had happened to Sophie. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the cold fear creeping up her spine. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "I was just trying to protect her," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I didn't want to hurt her. But I couldn't let them." "What are you talking about?" Sarah's patience snapped. "Who is she? Where is Sophie?" The man took a deep breath, his hands trembling. "She's in there," he said, pointing to a small door at the back of the cabin. "But you have to understand, it wasn't supposed to happen like this." "I didn't." Sarah's hand shot out. "Stop talking. Show me where she is." As they approached the door, Max's ears flattened against his head. He growled again, but there was something different about it now, something more desperate. Sarah's pulse quickened as she reached for the handle, her mind racing with all the possible horrors that lay behind that door. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat as the faint smell of decay hit her. Inside, a small room, barely big enough for a bed, was lit only by the weak glow of a nearby lantern. And there, lying motionless on the floor, was Sophie. Terror flooded Sarah's chest as she rushed forward, her knees buckling as she checked the little girl's pulse. Her heart nearly stopped as she felt the weak, irregular beat. "She's still alive," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice shaky with disbelief. "But just barely." The man's face twisted in anguish. "I didn't mean to do it. I swear." "Save it." Sarah snapped, pulling out her radio. "Get an ambulance out here now." The truth was becoming clearer, but there were still more questions than answers. Why was Sophie here? Why had she been abandoned in this shack? And who was the man who had brought her here? As Sarah knelt beside Sophie, doing her best to comfort the child, one thing was certain, this case was far from over. And the truth was much darker than anyone had anticipated. The rain had stopped by the time the ambulance arrived. The scene outside the cabin felt almost surreal in the quiet aftermath. The bright flashing lights of the paramedics' vehicles cut through the night, painting the surrounding trees in garish red and blue hues. As the paramedics rushed Sophie into the back of the ambulance, Sarah's thoughts were still racing, trying to piece together the mess they had just uncovered. The cabin, the doll, the bloodstains. Sophie is barely clinging to life. Max stood by her side, his fur damp from the night's ordeal, but his posture was proud, unshaken. His sharp eyes locked onto Sarah's as if asking if she was okay. It was as if the dog understood everything. He knew they had to keep moving forward. They couldn't afford to look back. Detective Miller. Officer Bennett shouted from the other side of the clearing, waving her over. She made her way toward him, feeling the weight of her thoughts dragging her down. "What do we have?" she asked, trying to sound more composed than she felt. Bennett handed her a small notebook, a page with scribbled notes. "We managed to track down some details about the man in the cabin." The name scrawled across the page was one Sarah had never heard before. It didn't ring any bells. "Michael Evans," Sarah muttered, her brow furrowed. "Who is he?" "Local handyman," Bennett said, shrugging. "No criminal record. He's been living here in the cabin for about 2 years now. Doesn't really interact much with the locals. Keeps to himself, that kind of thing." "But why was he hiding the girl?" Sarah asked, already feeling the anger welling up in her chest. "How does he fit into all of this?" "I'm not sure," Bennett replied. "But we did find something interesting." He handed her another sheet of paper. Sarah glanced down at the document. It was a copy of a police report, one that had been filed just a few days ago. The report was about Sophie's father, David Carter. "It looks like there was a disturbance at the Carter household a week ago," Bennett continued. "A fight broke out between David Carter and his wife, and it was all over their daughter's custody. Apparently, David hasn't been the best parent. He's had a history of getting violent when things don't go his way. So, here's the interesting part, Sophie was supposed to be with her mom that night, but she wasn't. She was supposed to be at a friend's house, but no one saw her." Sarah's mind started to race again. She looked over at Max, his gaze steady and watchful. It was all starting to come together. "There's more," Bennett added. "It looks like Evans was working for David Carter. At least, he was doing some renovations on the Carter house about a month ago. According to the neighbors, Evans was seen talking to David often. It doesn't look good." Sarah clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. "We need to bring in David Carter for questioning," she said, her voice resolute. "And we need to find out what Michael Evans really knows about Sophie's disappearance. I'm betting there's more to this than a simple custody dispute." The next few hours felt like a blur of activity. Back at the station, they brought in David Carter, the man who had become the focal point of everything that was wrong with Sophie's life. Sarah stood behind the two-way mirror, watching as Carter sat in the interrogation room. He was disheveled, his face pale, eyes darting nervously. His hands were shaking, his posture hunched. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder, was it fear or guilt that was making him tremble? "Detective Miller," Bennett called from behind the glass. "We've got him talking, but something feels off." Sarah looked over at Bennett, then back at David. "What do you mean?" "He's acting like he's the victim here," Bennett replied. "Like everything's been done to him. But I don't know. There's something in his eyes. I think he's hiding something." She nodded and stepped toward the door. If Carter was going to crack, it was up to her to make him break. When Sarah walked into the interrogation room, David immediately sat up straighter. His eyes flicked to hers, and for a moment, there was a strange kind of recognition. He didn't speak right away, as though he was calculating his next move. "Mr. Carter," Sarah began, her voice firm but calm. I'm going to be blunt with you. Your daughter is fighting for her life. We have evidence that you know more about her disappearance than you're letting on. So, let's start from the beginning. Where is Sophie? David swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he folded them in front of him. I don't know where she is, he snapped, his voice rising. I swear to God, I don't know where she is. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. You're telling me you had no idea what was happening with your daughter? That you had no idea where she was or who took her? I didn't know she was gone, David stammered, his voice cracking. She was supposed to be at her mom's. I swear to God, I didn't know anything about this. Why are you blaming me? Sarah's patience was running thin. She needed him to crack. You're telling me that Michael Evans didn't bring Sophie to the cabin? David froze, his eyes widening. Evans? What do you mean? What does he have to do with this? Sarah's hand moved to the folder on the table, pulling out the police report. She slid it across to him. You tell me, Mr. Carter. Your neighbor, Michael Evans, is the one who had Sophie hidden in that cabin, and I have reason to believe you know exactly why he did it. David's face drained of color, his eyes darting to the door, his mouth opening and closing like he was looking for an escape. I didn't ask him to take her, he whispered. I didn't. Then why didn't you report her missing, David? Sarah pressed. You knew she was gone, and yet you didn't do anything. You let this go on for days. David's shoulders sagged, his eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't, he murmured. I couldn't risk losing her completely. I couldn't lose her, not to them. Sarah's heart began to pound as the words sank in. The real truth was finally beginning to surface. As the interview continued, the pieces fell into place. David Carter had been involved with Michael Evans far more than he had ever let on. Their relationship wasn't just about property renovations. It was a darker, more twisted connection. Michael Evans had been coerced into helping David. He hadn't been the mastermind behind the abduction, but he had been manipulated, a pawn in a far more dangerous game. David's desperation to keep Sophie at any cost had driven him to make unimaginable decisions. Back at the station, Sarah's phone rang. It was the paramedics. Sophie was awake. The relief that flooded her chest was palpable, but the weight of the truth, the complete and utter horror of it all, was still settling in. Sophie had survived, but the path ahead was far from simple. There was still more to uncover. The news of Sophie's condition spread quickly through the police station. Paramedics had worked tirelessly to stabilize her, but she was still fragile. Sarah's mind kept replaying the scene at the cabin, the twisted puzzle that had unfolded before her eyes. Michael Evans had been hiding something far worse than anyone could have anticipated. And David Carter, his desperation to keep Sophie for himself, his willingness to drag others into the mess, had taken everything to a place no one had expected. But now, there was hope. Sophie was alive, though barely, and somehow, they still hadn't found all the answers. Detective Miller, we've got something, Officer Bennett said, approaching her desk. He was holding a thick folder, his eyes serious as he laid it down in front of her. We've got new intel on Evans. He's been tied to more than just this case. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she reached for the folder, flipping it open to find a series of photographs. One of them caught her attention immediately. It was a picture of Michael Evans standing next to a man she hadn't seen before. The stranger was older, with hard eyes and a stone-cold stare. We've been going through Evans's old records, Bennett continued. This man's name is Victor Salazar. He's a known associate of some dangerous figures, heavily involved in organized crime. It looks like Evans got in way deeper than we realized. Sarah set the photo down with a grim look on her face. So, Evans wasn't just a simple handyman. He was part of something bigger. Exactly, Bennett said, pacing back and forth. And according to his old landlord, Evans mentioned something about being in debt to someone. Salazar is likely the one who pressured him into taking Sophie. We're talking about a whole network here: drugs, illegal arms, you name it. The realization hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about a missing child anymore. They were dealing with something much darker, something that could stretch far beyond their small town. And Sophie, in some twisted way, had become a pawn in this underworld game. Do we know where Salazar is now? Sarah asked, her voice calm despite the growing storm inside her. We're tracking his last known locations, Bennett replied. But he's good at covering his tracks. I'm thinking we might need to expand our search. If he's connected to Evans, then this whole thing could be a lot more dangerous than we initially thought. Sarah rubbed her temples, trying to focus. She knew time was running out. Sophie had survived, but the damage done to her mind, to her soul, Sarah couldn't even begin to imagine what the little girl had been through. And the truth was, they hadn't even touched the surface yet. I'll start looking into Salazar, Sarah said, her voice firm. But we need to bring in Evans. He's the key to all of this. He knows more than he's letting on. Meanwhile, across town, David Carter was still in the holding cell. The anger and frustration that had been simmering in Sarah's chest since the night of Sophie's rescue were threatening to spill over. She had to keep it together. But how could she? David Carter had been hiding in plain sight. And even now, with all the evidence against him, he still refused to give up the truth. Sarah walked into the interrogation room, trying to ignore the pounding in her head. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice colder than she intended. We need to talk. David didn't look at her at first, his hands resting on the table, his eyes locked on the floor. But when he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, there was a certain defiance in his eyes. Mr. Carter, Sarah began again, her voice firm but calm. I'm going to be blunt with you. Your daughter is fighting for her life. We have evidence that you know more about her disappearance than you're letting on. So, let's start from the beginning. Where is Sophie? David swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he folded them in front of him. I don't know where she is, he snapped, his voice rising. I swear to God, I don't know where she is. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes never leaving his. You're telling me you had no idea what was happening with your daughter? That you had no idea where she was or who took her? I didn't know she was gone, David stammered, his voice cracking. She was supposed to be at her mom's. I swear to God, I didn't know anything about this. Why are you blaming me? Sarah's patience was running thin. She needed him to crack. You're telling me that Michael Evans didn't bring Sophie to the cabin? David froze, his eyes widening. Evans? What do you mean? What does he have to do with this? Sarah's hand moved to the folder on the table, pulling out the police report. She slid it across to him. You tell me, Mr. Carter. Your neighbor, Michael Evans, is the one who had Sophie hidden in that cabin, and I have reason to believe you know exactly why he did it. David's face drained of color, his eyes darting to the door, his mouth opening and closing like he was looking for an escape. I didn't ask him to take her, he whispered. I didn't. Then why didn't you report her missing, David? Sarah pressed. You knew she was gone, and yet you didn't do anything. You let this go on for days. David's shoulders sagged, his eyes welling up with tears. I couldn't, he murmured. I couldn't risk losing her completely. I couldn't lose her, not to them. Sarah's heart began to pound as the words sank in. The real truth was finally beginning to surface. As the interview continued, the pieces fell into place. David Carter had been involved with Michael Evans far more than he had ever let on. Their relationship wasn't just about property renovations. It was a darker, more twisted connection. Michael Evans had been coerced into helping David. He hadn't been the mastermind behind the abduction, but he had been manipulated, a pawn in a far more dangerous game. David's desperation to keep Sophie at any cost had driven him to make unimaginable decisions. Back at the station, Sarah's phone rang. It was the paramedics. Sophie was awake. The relief that flooded her chest was palpable, but the weight of the truth, the complete and utter horror of it all, was still settling in. Sophie had survived. The news that Sophie was awake spread like wildfire through the station. Sarah's heart had been heavy for so long, every minute feeling like an eternity. But now, finally, there was a spark of hope. Sophie had made it through the worst, and Sarah wasn't about to let this case slip through the cracks. By the time she arrived at the hospital, Sophie had been moved to a private room. The faint smell of antiseptic hung in the air, but the atmosphere was calm, surprisingly so, considering what the young girl had been through. Sarah stepped into the room, Max at her side, his tail wagging slightly, though his ears were still pinned with concern. The dog had been Sophie's guardian through it all, and Sarah could sense the unspoken bond between them. Detective Miller, the nurse greeted her as she stepped in. "The little girl's been asking for you." Sarah nodded, her throat tightening. She had prepared herself for what she might hear, but nothing could quite ready her for the reality of what was about to unfold. She approached the bed carefully, her footsteps light, as she didn't want to startle Sophie. The girl's face was pale, her small body wrapped in a thin hospital gown. Her eyes were wide, fear still evident despite the warmth of the room. But when she saw Sarah, a flicker of recognition appeared in her eyes. Are you the one who saved me?" Sophie whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. Sarah knelt beside her, her heart aching at the sight of the child's fragile state. "Yes, sweetie," she said gently. "We're going to make sure you're safe now. You're not alone anymore." Sophie didn't respond right away, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She looked at Max, who had approached the side of the bed, his large head resting gently on the edge. Sophie reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she stroked his fur. "Max," Sophie whispered, her voice cracking. "He was always there, wasn't he? He stayed with me." Sarah watched as the girl's small fingers brushed over the dog's coat, her face softening for the first time since she'd been found. "Yes, he never left your side. He's a hero, just like you." Sophie smiled faintly, but her expression soon clouded. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting away from Sarah's. "Where's my dad?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I want to see him." Sarah's heart dropped at the question. How could she tell her that her father had played a role in all of this? How could she explain that the man who was supposed to protect her had, in fact, been the one to put her in danger? Sophie deserved to know the truth, but the right moment hadn't come yet. She had already been through too much. "Your dad is, well, we're still trying to figure some things out," Sarah said softly. "But you're going to be okay now. We're going to keep you safe." The young girl nodded slowly, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. Is he the reason I was there?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah wasn't sure how to answer. Sophie was so young, and the truth would crush her. But as a detective, Sarah couldn't lie to her. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but she had no intention of letting the child suffer any more than she already had. "Your dad, he was involved, but it wasn't just him," Sarah said carefully. "There were other people, dangerous people, but that's all over now. We're going to make sure no one can hurt you anymore." Sophie looked at her intently. Did he want to hurt me?" Her eyes were wide, filled with a kind of fear that no child should ever have to carry. Sarah's heart shattered. "No, honey," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion. "Your dad was confused, but he never wanted to hurt you. He just made some really bad choices. But don't worry, you're safe now." The room fell silent for a moment. Sophie lay back on her pillow, staring up at the ceiling as though trying to process everything. It wasn't just the physical pain she'd endured. It was the mental and emotional scars that would take far longer to heal. And they would heal. Sarah would make sure of it. The following days were filled with more questions, more investigation. Michael Evans had been apprehended and was in custody, but David Carter was still out there, his motives unclear. He'd been charged with child endangerment and abduction, but as the investigation continued, more layers to the story were uncovered. The connections between Carter, Evans, and Victor Salazar, the dangerous figure in the criminal world, were beginning to take shape. Sarah and her team pieced together the timeline, each new detail bringing them closer to understanding the full extent of the crime. It wasn't just about a custody dispute. It wasn't just about Evans helping a desperate father. It was about a network, one that stretched far beyond the town's borders, with ties to people who had no qualms about using children as leverage. But as the case progressed, Sarah found herself struggling with the weight of it all. How could she protect the innocent from a system so broken? It wasn't just the criminals she had to deal with. It was the fractured system that allowed people like Evans and Salazar to operate in the shadows for so long. And then there was Sophie. She was the one thing that made all the pain, all the sacrifice, worth it. She was the one who had survived against all odds. Detective Miller, the voice came from the doorway, pulling Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned to see Officer Bennett standing there, holding another file. "What do we have?" she asked, her voice already tired. "We've got more on Salazar," Bennett said, his tone grim. "Turns out he's not just involved in drug trafficking. We found connections to human trafficking. He's been running operations out of the city for years, and it's all connected to the kidnapping." Sarah felt her stomach twist. Human trafficking. The words felt too heavy for the air in the room. "If Salazar's involved in that," Sarah said, her voice quiet but determined, "then this case is bigger than we thought." "That's not all," Bennett added. "We've been going through Evans's phone records. There are texts, messages between him and Salazar. It looks like they had a plan for Sophie all along." Sarah clenched her jaw. So, Sophie wasn't just a pawn in a custody dispute. She was part of something far worse. "Exactly," Bennett said. "And we're going to make sure they pay for it." As Sarah left the station that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still missing something. There was more to the story, more layers to uncover. But one thing was clear: Sophie would be okay. No matter what, she would get the help she needed. And she would never be alone again. Because as long as Sarah had breath in her lungs, she would fight for the truth. She would fight for Sophie. The morning after the breakthrough, the air at the station was heavy with anticipation. Sarah had spent the night sifting through mountains of evidence, piecing together the web of connections that stretched far beyond the small town. The deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. It was no longer just about one man, one crime. It was a whole underground network. And Sophie's abduction was only the beginning of a much darker story. Sarah sat at her desk, her eyes tired but determined. She glanced at the photo of Sophie on the wall, a picture from the hospital room taken just hours ago, where the girl had been brave enough to smile for the camera. Sophie was recovering slowly but surely, but the real work was just beginning. Sarah knew that getting justice for Sophie was going to take everything she had. She picked up the phone and dialed Officer Bennett's number. "We're getting closer to Victor Salazar," Bennett said when he picked up. "I've tracked down one of his old associates, and they're willing to talk." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is it? What do they know?" "His name is Ryan Torres. He was part of Salazar's operation, but he's trying to get out. He's scared, though. He's worried about what might happen to him if Salazar finds out he's talking." "I don't care about his fear," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "We need him. We need everything he knows." "I'm setting up a meeting with him now," Bennett said. "We'll meet at the diner on Oak Street in an hour." I'll have a team ready in case anything goes sideways. Good, Sarah said. I'll be there. Let's make sure we get this right. We're not just going after Salazar anymore. We're going after the whole operation. When Sarah arrived at the diner, she saw Bennett sitting in a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the room. Ryan Torres was sitting across from him, a nervous-looking man in his early 30s. He kept glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out at him at any moment. His clothes were unkempt, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. As Sarah slid into the seat next to Bennett, Torres flinched slightly but didn't say anything. "You're safe here," Sarah said, trying to reassure him. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need information." Torres nodded slowly, but the fear was still evident in his eyes. "I don't know what you think I can tell you," he said, his voice shaky. "Salazar is a dangerous man. He's got connections, people you don't want to mess with. I'm just a small part of the whole thing." "You've got more than you think," Bennett said, leaning forward. "We know Salazar's been running a human trafficking ring. He's using kids. And we know Sophie was just one of many. We're not here to judge you. We're here to stop this once and for all." Torres swallowed hard, his hands trembling. "I don't know how much I can help you, but I can tell you this: Salazar is not the one calling the shots. He's just a middleman. There's someone higher up." "A woman." "A woman?" Sarah echoed, leaning in closer. "Who?" Torres shook his head. "I don't know her name. I never met her in person. But Salazar talked about her. She runs things. And she's the one pulling all the strings. He'd do whatever she said. She's got power, serious power." "Where is she?" Sarah asked urgently. "I don't know. I swear. All I know is that she's connected to Salazar's network, and she's got a lot of pull with people who don't care about the law. If she's involved in this, there's no telling how far it goes." Sarah felt the knot in her stomach tighten. A woman. She didn't know if this was a lead that could lead them to the true mastermind behind everything, but it was a lead, and they couldn't afford to let it slip through their fingers. "Do you have anything else? Any details that could help us find her?" Sarah pressed. Torres hesitated, looking around nervously before speaking again. "I overheard Salazar talking once. He said something about a meeting coming up, something big. He was supposed to take someone to a warehouse outside the city. I don't know when it's happening, but I think it's important." "Which warehouse?" Bennett asked. Torres ran a hand through his hair, glancing at both of them before finally speaking. "I think it's in the old industrial park near the docks. There's a warehouse there they've been using for operations. Salazar goes there a lot. I don't know much more." Sarah stood up, her mind already racing. The warehouse could be the break they'd been waiting for. It could be where everything was happening: the hidden human trafficking ring, the connections to Salazar's mysterious female boss. Everything. "Thank you, Ryan," Sarah said, her voice steady. "You've helped us more than you know." Torres seemed to relax a little, though his nervousness remained. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he said softly. "You are," Sarah said, her voice firm. "But this isn't over yet. You stay out of sight. We'll take it from here." The team was already assembling as Sarah and Bennett made their way to the industrial park. The tension in the air was palpable. They had the location, and they had the information. It was time to put everything on the line and go after Salazar and his mysterious associate. But there was still the question of whether they would get there in time. As the team approached the warehouse, Sarah's mind raced. They knew this was it. If they didn't act now, they might lose everything. Sophie's survival was a small victory, but it wasn't enough. They needed to stop the entire operation. They parked at a distance and moved in quietly. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Every step felt heavy, like they were walking into a trap, but there was no turning back now. As they neared the entrance of the warehouse, Sarah motioned for the team to stay low. The dim light of the evening cast long shadows over the building. She could hear the faint sound of voices coming from inside. There was no time to waste. "This is it," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Let's move." They breached the door, guns drawn, ready to confront whoever was inside. The scene that awaited them was unlike anything Sarah had expected. Inside, a group of men and women were gathered, looking up in shock as the officers entered. And in the middle of it all, standing tall with a cold smile on her face, was the woman they had been looking for, the mastermind behind it all. The moment Sarah stepped inside the warehouse, everything shifted. The air was thick with tension, and the low hum of voices in the distance barely reached her ears. It was as though the entire world had narrowed to just this one moment, the culmination of everything they had fought for. She wasn't sure what would await them, but she knew there would be no turning back now. The warehouse was large, its walls echoing with the sounds of activity. Several people stood scattered around, their faces nervous and expectant as they turned their attention toward the entrance. At the far end of the room, standing with her back to them, was the woman they had been hunting, the mysterious mastermind behind it all. She was tall, with dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, and she exuded a cold, calculated air. The moment she heard the door open, she turned with a smirk, her eyes glinting with confidence. "So, you finally found me," she said, her voice smooth and commanding. "I knew it was only a matter of time." Sarah's heart was racing, her hands steady as she gripped her weapon. She wasn't about to let this woman slip away, especially after everything they had uncovered. "You're under arrest for human trafficking, kidnapping, and numerous other charges," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "It's over." The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she looked Sarah up and down with a look of almost amused disinterest. "You think it's over?" she asked, her lips curling into a smirk. "You have no idea what you're up against. This operation is just one small piece of something much bigger. You'll never stop it. You'll never stop me." Sarah didn't flinch, though her mind raced. She had heard this before from criminals who thought they were untouchable. But something about this woman's confidence made her pause for just a second. What was she hiding? What was really going on? Before Sarah could respond, one of the men in the room reached for a gun. It was a small movement, but it was enough. The tension in the air snapped like a wire, and the next few seconds played out like slow motion. Without thinking, Sarah's training kicked in. She raised her gun and shot, hitting the man square in the shoulder. He crumpled to the ground with a scream, his weapon falling from his hand. "Get down!" Bennett shouted, pulling Sarah to the ground behind a stack of crates as bullets began to fly. The woman at the far end of the warehouse watched it all unfold with eerie calmness, not even flinching as the chaos erupted around her. It was as though she was used to this, used to people falling at her feet. "Take cover!" Sarah yelled to her team, already moving into position. The gunfire rang out, filling the air with the sharp, deafening crack of gunshots. The team was well trained, and they responded with practiced precision. Bennett and the others returned fire, taking down anyone who dared to make a move. But through the chaos, Sarah's eyes never left the woman. She wasn't running. She wasn't even scared. And that made Sarah even more determined to end this. Minutes later, the gunfire ceased. The warehouse was eerily quiet, save for the sound of heavy breathing and the faint groaning of the wounded. Sarah's heart was pounding as she pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaky from the adrenaline. "Clear the area," she ordered, looking around. "I need to know where she went." The woman, her name was Elena Vega, had disappeared. Sarah knew she couldn't let her get away. They had all the pieces now, but they couldn't let the final piece slip through their fingers. "Where is she?" Sarah muttered to herself, frustration mounting. Elena Vega had been running this operation for years, pulling strings from the shadows. She wasn't just a criminal, she was a mastermind who had evaded justice for too long. The team split up, searching every corner of the warehouse. Finally, one of the officers found a hidden door in the back, leading to a stairwell that descended deep into the ground. "It's a basement," the officer called out. "Looks like she was using this place for storage, too. And there's another door down here, might be where she's hiding." Sarah nodded. "Let's move." They made their way down, guns drawn, every step measured. The hallway was narrow, lit by dim, flickering lights. There was no sound, no movement, just the oppressive feeling that they were closing in on something dangerous. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as they approached the final door. She motioned for the team to stop, her mind calculating the next move. They had her cornered, but there was still a chance she would try to escape. Sarah wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. With a deep breath, Sarah pushed open the door. Inside, Elena Vega was standing, waiting. She didn't have a gun in her hand, but there was no mistaking the cold, calculated look in her eyes. She knew the game was up. "You don't have to do this," Elena said, her voice almost gentle. "You don't understand. I did what I had to do for survival." Sarah didn't hesitate. "You stole children. You destroyed lives. You don't get to play the victim." For the first time, Elena's mask of confidence cracked. There was a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "I did what was necessary," Elena said, almost pleading now. "You have no idea what it's like to be trapped, to have no way out. People like you don't know what it's like to live in the shadows, to do what you have to in order to survive." Sarah stood tall, her heart still pounding in her chest. "You chose this life, and now you're going to pay for it." In one swift motion, she cuffed Elena and led her back toward the team. Elena didn't resist. She had been cornered, and she knew there was no way out now. She was done. As Sarah and her team made their way back to the police station, the weight of the case began to settle in. Elena Vega was the final piece of a much larger puzzle. She wasn't just a criminal mastermind, she was part of an entire network of exploitation and abuse. But now, the ring was broken, and Sophie, along with countless others, would have the chance to rebuild their lives. As Sarah sat at her desk, her hands shaking from the adrenaline, she couldn't help but reflect on everything they had been through, the darkness they had uncovered, the lives they had saved. But it wasn't over yet. There was still so much work to do. There would be more cases, more battles to fight. But as long as she had breath in her lungs, Sarah would keep fighting for the truth. Thank you for following Sophie's journey and for staying with us through this story on K9 Miracle Stories. It's been a long and emotional road, but we've made it through together. What do you believe was the turning point for Sophie's case? How do you think Sarah's next step should be? Let us know in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe to K9 Miracle Stories now. Don't miss the next incredible tale of courage and heart.